Alright, hi everyone. Welcome to this video on the chapter 18, ecology. Now, ecology is a pretty interesting chapter where it talks about all the different types of factors that's affecting how organisms interact with their surroundings. So this is the part whereby you will really start to understand about what we call biodiversity, and you see how different organisms can affect one another as they live in the ecosystem. So I hope you have gotten ready your notes, and with that, let's get started on this chapter. Now, a quick overview of this chapter, what exactly is it about. Now, this chapter, if I can really sum it up with a short clip, it will be this short movie clip from the animated film called Avatar. Right, so let's take a look at this short clip.
Progress! Move! Go! 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 No, get back! Back!
Now, as you can see from a short clip, what exactly is going on? We see a lot of different species of aliens as well as other creatures interacting with one another. We also see how the environment can affect and also to protect or injure some of the different species. Now, this is what this entire chapter is about. It's trying to get us to understand how exactly can the environment and the organisms interact and support one another in the ecosystem. Now, before I can go on further, let's just introduce you to some of the terms, right? So some of the terms that you might have seen before in primary school. Habitat refers to a place where the organism lives. So for example, your freshwater stream, forest, grassland, mangrove. Basically a location where the organism is found in. The term population, community, as well as ecosystem, which you might have already come across in primary school, right? So just a recap, population refers to a group of the same species, right? So for example, the human population, right? So it's referring to all of the humans. Community will refer to all the populations that is living and interacting with one another in a particular habitat. So for example, within the community that we are in, there will be us as a human species, of course, the other animals such as the cats, the dogs, the rats, as insects, all these together, we form a community. As for the term ecosystem, right? Ecosystem refers to the community plus what we call the abiotic environment. Okay, what exactly is abiotic, I will elaborate later on. And of course, ecology, the entire term of ecology refers to the study of the interaction of organisms with one another, as well as with their environment. So let's dive deeper in trying to understand what exactly is the meaning between abiotic as well as biotic environment. As of now, there is still not much to copy down. It's mainly to introduce you to this chapter. Now, the abiotic environment refers to all the physical factors that's around an organism. That means it's not the living things. The biotic environment refers to all the living things that an organism interacts with. So if you think of us as humans, right? So for ourselves, our abiotic environment will be things like the water, the light, and air around us. But the biotic environment will be, for example, you with your classmates, you with the teachers, you with your pets, or you with other animals that's along the streets, right? That's called the biotic environment. So bio means living things, right? That's why this chapter is, this entire subject is called biology. So just some examples of abiotic environment, right? So at least we have an idea of what they comprises of. So things like light intensity, right? Light intensity is a type of abiotic environment. It can affect the growth of plants. Water, right? Water is a type of abiotic environment as well, a factor, because it does impact us, just that it's not a living thing. So how exactly does water affect us? And we talk about how exactly is the leaf adapted to reduce water loss. And right here, over here, I have the cactus plant, right? So for a cactus plant, they have very thin and small surface area for their leaves, right? So it's actually the needles are the leaf. And what it does is this helps to reduce the rate of transpiration, right? So a bit of recap, so that the plant will not lose water that quickly and will not dry up or wilt and die. For the camels, right, the camels also have certain type of adaptations, right? They have the humps that can help to store water, and they also have very, very long eyelashes to protect themselves from the dry climate that they survive in. Another abiotic environment, the factor will be temperature, right? Temperature does affect enzymes, as all of us know, so it is one of the factors that can affect the living things. Oxygen, right? Definitely oxygen is needed for respiration to occur. Last but not least, pH, right? pH, as we have learned earlier on, it also affects the rate of enzyme activity, so therefore it's going to affect living things. Yep, and that is just some factors that's within the abiotic environment around us. Now, what about biotic environment? Now, biotic environment refers to the interaction between living things. Right, it's important to understand that all the organisms in a community are actually interdependent of one another. So, for instance, us as humans, right, we are dependent on, for example, the chickens for their eggs, right, for our diet. We are dependent on the maize plant for the rice grains for our diet, right, for all the noodles that we eat, all these things. Bread, right? So bread came from flour, and flour must have came from a certain type of plants, right? So that's how we see that all the different type of organisms are actually interrelated to one another. These kind of interactions might either be good for us, beneficial, or it might be harmful. But what is important is to understand that so long as we change one of the type of organism, so long as we impact one of them, it can actually affect the entire community. Right? So, for example, let's say that I remove all the fruits from the supermarket, right? That will in turn affect your diet, and in turn you will have an impact on the human species, right? So that's what we're trying to get you to understand. So what could be some of the beneficial or harmful relationships in the animal kingdom, right? What could be some of the things that we see out there? Now I'm going to show you a short clip now to show you an example of type of interactions between organisms, and I would like you to think about whether is it beneficial or is it harmful.
Incredibly, 80% of all insects live in jungles. Few are more successful than the ants. There can be 8 million individuals in a single hectare. But jungle ants don't have it all their own way. These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms. Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds. Its infected brain directs this ant upwards. Then, utterly disorientated, it grips a stem with its mandibles. Those afflicted that are discovered by the workers are quickly taken away and dumped far away from the colony. It seems extreme, but this is the reason why. Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head. It can take 3 weeks to grow, and when finished, the deadly spores will burst from its tip. Then, any ant in the vicinity will be in serious risk of death. The fungus is so virulent, it can wipe out whole colonies of ants. And it's not just ants that fall victim to this killer. There are literally thousands of different types of cordyceps fungi, and remarkably, each specializes on just one species. But these attacks do have a positive effect on the jungle's diversity, since parasites like these stop any one group of animal getting the upper hand. The more numerous a species becomes, the more likely it will be attacked by its nemesis, a cordyceps fungus.
Alright, so as you can see from the video itself, this is actually what we call a parasite, right? A parasite, it forms a relationship whereby it takes advantage of the host. So it's a bit like how if you think of bacteria infecting us, making us fall sick, or like in fact even virus like COVID-19, right, infecting humans and using humans as an opportunity for them to replicate and produce more of themselves. That's actually a parasitic relationship. So one organism will benefit, the other one will suffer, right? So that's what you see in this clip as well. But not all relationships must be like that, right? This is another example of a parasitic relationship, pretty disgusting over here. So what you see is that a particular type of bug has actually infested the tongue of the fish, right? So it's not that the bug is sitting on the tongue, but rather it's growing out from the tongue, attaching itself to the tongue already. So this is an example of a parasitic relationship. So the bug actually feeds off all the food that the fish is trying to get. And eventually what happens for parasites is that once the host is weak enough, like the host is going to die already, then the parasite will leave, right? So after you use up all the things. But of course, over here we also have what we call a beneficial symbiotic relationship. Like let's say between your pollinators, like your butterflies or your bees, with the flowers which provides nectar, right? So while the insects get the nectar as food, the insects also help the plants to spread their pollen through insect pollination methods, right? So this is what you have learned earlier on as well. Right, and with that, we have completed just an introduction to the idea of ecology as well as the different factors that will impact the organisms. So we need to understand that energy and nutrients are actually being transferred from a certain organism to another one via the process of feeding, right? I do have to emphasize on this word feeding because that's what O-level recognizes as the description of how nutrient actually flows. Right, so do use the word feeding to describe how exactly is energy and nutrient being passed along. So there's actually three types of organisms that we can classify the different types of organisms in the ecosystem. So you can classify them as a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. So let's talk about each of them and how they work. So for producers, right, what they do is that they will convert light energy from the sun into chemical energy by the process of photosynthesis. All food chains will have to start with a producer, and that's how it works, right? So some examples will be your green plants, that's definite, and then there's green algae, and there's even smaller organisms within the water, which we call phytoplankton, right? So phytoplanktons are actually not your plants, they're actually what we call microorganisms. So let me just write this down. So they are usually found within the water itself. In terms of consumers, there's three types of consumers, and all of them obtain energy by feeding on other organisms. So they are what we call primary consumers. So primary consumers are the herbivores, right, which you have learned in primary school before. So they only feed on plants, so they are the first one after the plant, right, in the food chain. Then you have your secondary consumers, right? Secondary consumers, they will feed on the primary consumers. They can either be carnivores, that means they purely eat meat, or they can also feed on the plants, so they are called omnivores. Then after that, you have what we call the tertiary consumers. So essentially, this means that when you look at a food chain, right, you can go from, it depends on different food chain, right? So some food chain will have a lot of these consumers feeding on one another. That's why you have a primary, secondary, tertiary as an example. Next, we also have this category called the decomposers. Now, decomposers work differently. They also obtain energy, but they don't exactly feed on the other organisms, or neither do they take light energy and use it to make food. They actually break down dead organisms, feces, or other form of waste products, right? And in this entire process of decomposing stuff, they actually release nutrients out. So these nutrients can be like carbon or nitrogen. then that's what we call nutrient cycling. So they actually helps to allow the nutrients to be reused back into the entire ecosystem. So some examples of these decomposers include fungi, bacteria, as well as your earthworms. So food chain, right? Food chain is a concept that you have learned before in primary school already, right? So basically, it actually refers to a series of organisms through which energy is being transferred in the form of feeding, right? So one will feed on the other one, so on and so forth. And this actually helps us to understand how exactly are these organisms dependent on one another. Every food chain must start with a producer, that's a given, and each organism actually is known as what we call a trophic level, right? So this is an example of a food chain, right? You start off with the grass, which is the plant, which is the producer. Then there's a grasshopper, followed by the toad, as well as the snake, right? So if you recall what I said earlier on, the grass in this case is what we call the producers, right? The grasshopper in this case, because it's a consumer, right? And it's the first one that feeds on the grass. So it's what I call a primary consumer. The toad will be what I call a secondary consumer. And the snake is what I call a tertiary consumer. Now, can there be more and more other different organisms in the food chain? If it happens to have, yes, but later on you'll realize that you seldom get a food chain that is that long in nature, and we'll talk about this later on. Okay, so what do I mean by trophic level? Now sometimes, right, or rather from now onwards, we seldom describe it as, okay, this is the first one, second one, third one, fourth one. We actually use this thing called trophic levels to describe them. So producers are what I call the first trophic level in this case. The grasshoppers are what I call the second trophic level. The toads are what I call the third trophic level. And the snake is what we call the fourth trophic level. So it depends on which stage you are looking at within a food chain. Okay, so if there's one more after the snake, that will be called a fifth trophic level. Now, what about food web? Right, food web is basically a lot of interlinked food chain. So it's a lot more complicated. You'll be looking at things like this, whereby one food chain can branch off to be connected to other types of food chain. So over here, you realize that in this entire food web, right, there's actually only one producer, which is just a green plant. But this one producer is being fed on by different types of primary consumer within the first trophic level. So all these, the caterpillar, the grasshopper, as well as the aphids over here, they are known as the primary consumer of their own food chain, right? So when you try to study the food web, right, it's good to just focus on a food chain by itself. Right, so this is one of the possible food chain. This is another possible food chain, right? But of course, it's interlinked, right? In the sense that some of the organisms actually are food for the other organisms in the other food chain, right? Food web will be a bit more complicated already, because when you start thinking about food web, right, you must also ask yourself, what happens if one of the organisms is being affected by, let's say, a disease, then they got extinct, right? So how is it going to impact the entire food web? So although the concept of food web and food chain is simple, it's important to always keep at the back of your mind that you must ask yourself, what happens if one of these organisms is gone, right? What will happen to the entire food chain or food web? Right? So that's the kind of things that we will ask, right? Not so much about like, do you know what's a food chain or do you know what's a food web? So there's really no need to go and memorize the definition. So what for learn about food chain and food web? This is actually to get us to appreciate how different organisms are actually interdependent to one another, and how affecting one of them can affect the rest. Okay, so let me show you an article from this magazine called Times Magazine. I think this was quite a long time ago. It's 2013, right? So they actually spoke about what will happen if the world, right, has no more bees, right? So imagine you take away all the bees in the whole world, and what will that actually impact us or not? Because if you think about it, you know, like what's the use of bees for us, right? If, let's say I don't take honey, then you might think that, oh, then I don't need bees at all. But bees actually play a very, very important role in the entire ecosystem. So they actually started to do some data research, and they found that if there's a drop in the bee population, it will actually result in a drop in food for many other different organisms. Why is that the case? Because bees are actually responsible for 70% of all pollination of plants, which means that without the bees, right, you will have less plants, and if there's less plants, it will mean that because plants are producers, right, so you're gonna cause a lot of the food chain to be disrupted, right? Because let's say you take away the producer from the entire food chain, then every other thing that comes after it, all the different trophic level, will suffer because they have no food, right? Then they will all die, right? So when they die, then the question is that what if we are eating all these kind of different food, right? Then we will be impacted as well, right? So this is the idea that we would like you to think about whenever you're looking at food chain and food web. So it's really more of the application, right? So over here, I have a few questions which I would like you to think about and then key in your answer to the palette link that will be shown later on at the end of the video, right? At the end of the video, there will be a QR code as well as a palette link. Please use the link to respond to this series of questions. You can also take the chance to look at what are some of your classmates' work, and you can comment on their work as well if you have any thoughts. So this is the first question, right? Usually, it's very, very hard for us to find any form of food chain that has more than 4 trophic levels. I would like you guys to think about why exactly is the case. Right? So over here, I have 3 sets of food chain, and each of them have 5 trophic level. So these are level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But in the real world, right, it's really quite tough to find food chain that has so many trophy levels. Right? Usually it has a max 4 only. But what could be the reason why? Okay, so just key in your response. There's no right or wrong answer. We'll go through this when we come back to class. Second question. Now, in a food chain, right, we are always starting with how energy is being transferred. So, do you think that the sun should be within a food chain, right? So, or the food web, in this case, right? Whether the answer is yes or no, think of a reason and write it down. Right, and for question 3, okay, let's say that you have a hypothetical food chain that involves carrots being eaten by rabbits, and the rabbits will then be eaten by some other organisms, which I don't know what it is, whatever that eats rabbit, right? So imagine that there is suddenly a certain type of pollutant that's being released to the area, and it actually caused all the rabbits to die. Okay, what do you think will happen to the population of the other organisms when the rabbits are dead? Okay, so this is trying to get you to think about how exactly are the different types of species related to one another, and come up with your own explanation of why do you think this species will be affected in this manner. Right? Try to elaborate a bit more, bring your own knowledge in, and key it within the palette. Alright, right now what you can do is that you can actually scan the QR code and or access the palette link as shown over here before we move on to the last part of the video. Okay, I hope you have already scanned the QR code and key your response to the palette. Right, we'll go through those questions when we are back in class. Now, to end off this part of the video, let's talk about how exactly is the energy transfer non-cyclic in nature. Non-cyclic means that, right, you cannot recycle the energy that came from the sun, right? So there's no way that the energy will eventually return back to the sun. It will somehow disappear or being used up for other things. So we know that the sun is the main energy source in an ecosystem. That means light is converted into chemical energy by the producers using the process of photosynthesis. That energy is being passed down from one organism to another one by the process of feeding. So what you see over here is that this flow of energy, right, is actually not cyclical. That means the last organism, right, at the very end of the food chain cannot possibly return the energy back to the sun. So there is no loop, right? So it's not a full cycle in that sense, because energy will always be lost to the environment. Why will energy be lost? All organisms give off heat, right? Whether you, just like you and I, right, there will be heat being produced out from the body, right? So as heat is being released out from the body, this will mean that this form of energy is lost. Energy is lost to the surrounding, and there's no way that you can take back this heat and put it back into the body for the next organism. So no matter what, as you look down a food chain, right, energy will gradually get less and less and less as you go along the entire food chain. Right? So for example, at the start, the producer will have a lot of energy from the sun. Once it's eaten by the rabbit, as the rabbit moves around, you will use up the energy, right? Or as the rabbit grow, you also use up the energy. Or when the rabbit releases heat, it also releases energy. Now when this rabbit is being eaten up by the snake no longer gets the full set of energy anymore. Right? Later on, you'll learn how to calculate. Right? But in this case, the snake will not get the full energy. And the snake, as it moves around, as it hunts for food, etc., it also uses up energy by itself. Then when the hawk eats the snake, right, it will no longer have as much energy as previously. Right, so this is why energy is being lost in the entire food chain, and that's why it's non-cyclical in nature. Alright, and with that we have come to the end of this component called energy and nutrient flow, and this is where this video will stop. Thank you.